This is the result of a beginner tutorial that helped train your mind to draw from imagination. I'm going to show you how right now. First thing we do is we draw a ground plane. So you kind of just draw a square. It's going to look like a diamond. You can add some depth to it if you want. This is a really casual tutorial, so there's not really too many rules. The main rule is that we're only going to use geometric shapes. So like boxes, cylinders, spheres, that sort of thing. Now you can manipulate them a little bit to make more complex shapes. But as you can see, I just start out with a box just to get started. And what you're doing is you're placing down these objects on the plane and you're kind of making a scene. Think of it like a little kid playing with building blocks. That's what it really is. You're playing with building blocks and you're making a scene. It doesn't have to be like structurally sound or make sense according to physics. It just has to feel 3D to you. Okay? So you can work on perspective if you want, but the main goal here is just to get some stuff on the paper. You don't plan it out beforehand, you just start throwing down shapes. So I'm just throwing down, like cylinders. I changed it up a little bit, and I made a tapered box that's curved, some cones. And usually what happens as you're doing this is you'll get some inspiration and you'll be like, okay, well, I can put a wall here, or I can make a building here, or this kind of looks like a theme park. And that's what happened here is I'm doing this and I was like, this kind of is feeling like some type of village, maybe. So draw it in. You do the best you can with these shapes. What this is really doing is training your eyes and is training your mind to think in 3D space. And you're just laying down simple objects, and the objects are so simple that there's no pressure. This is the biggest beauty of this exercise is there's zero pressure to get things looking nice. I know when I was a beginner, I really panicked I was really focused on everything had to be perfect. If it didn't look perfect, then it was trash. And that hindered my development a lot. So this will hopefully help you relax a little bit and accept that some things aren't going to look right. And what I'm doing here is readjusting the ground plane. I didn't like how thick it was, so I changed it. And I'm drawing this shape in here. I really don't know where I'm going with the shape, but it looks kind of like a stadium. So I run with it. And then I just add a triangle on top of the box that I started at the beginning. So now I got a house looking shape. Oh, that's cool. So. And what I do recommend doing is starting with really big shapes and then move to small shapes. That's kind of like the golden rule of drawing is you work from big to small. And so I'll draw like these big shapes like you saw me draw the wall, the stadium. And then I start adding like more detailed buildings, or maybe like these little trees or pole looking things. You don't have, it's not a hard fast rule, but it's a pretty strong rule. But with this exercise, I would really like you just to ignore all the rules and just draw almost like you're doodling. Just get the shapes down. But I got my scene set up, so I'm going to soft erase it. So if you're working traditionally, you take your kneaded eraser and you rub over it till it's like faded. If you're working digitally, you can use an soft airbrush to erase it, or you can just lower the opacity and then do a new layer. Whatever works for you. But on this stage, we're refining it. And so what I like to do is make it a little more interesting than just like rectangles and stuff. So I'm putting in archways. I'm adding little details to it. Not overly complicated details. This is, a simple tutorial. I mean, you can add as much detail as you want. That's not really the point of the exercise. But I'm just trying to make it interesting. So I added all these archways to it. And you can even see, like, some of my buildings don't even make sense. Like, I have, like, half of a house right next to the wall. Like, it doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be 3D, like a 3D block that fits onto your ground plane. The ground plane is mainly just there to make it feel like it's not floating, like everything, like, belongs together. So I smooth out this shape. I make it a little bit more cylinder. And one thing a mistake that people make a lot in this stage, the refining stage, is they kind of just like trace over their rough, and they're tracing over it completely. And they end up just doing the exact same thing. It's not about, I mean, it's a lot of it is just cleaning up the lines and making them look cleaner. But like I did with the arches, you want to add to the drawing. Every time you soft erase and you draw over your drawing, you want to add something more to it. And you don't have to completely follow your lines. Maybe you decide that I didn't like this line over here, I'm going to move it over here. And you just it's called refining, right? So you're making it better little by little by little. And you can keep soft erasing and refining as many times as you need to. And the way you get cleaner lines is you want to avoid hairy, scratchy lines. So you want to make long, fluid strokes. And the way you do that is you do what's called ghosting, where you take your pencil off the paper and you do some practice lines in the air. So your pencil's moving like you're drawing, but you're not actually drawing. And then when you're ready, you draw a line and you kind of just throw it out there and expect that the muscle memory that you trained your arm to have will draw the line for you. And you kind of just trust that to happen instead of drawing extremely slowly. Draw a Box actually has a really good tutorial on ghosting that you can check out if you want to. The order that you do your cleanup isn't overly necessary, since you have the back, you have the drawing underneath that you're drawing over. Some people, like, it does help to be organized, so some people like to work outside in. It's just whatever, like for this one, it was just like whatever I felt like drawing at the time. This shape, like, I guess it kind of looks like a church or a rocket coming out of the ground. I don't know. I'm struggling with getting circle right. And I thought it would be cool to like add in like a hole here. Just basically, all I'm doing is how can I make this look more interesting? And one way of changing things up is, okay, I'll throw in a hole here. I'll add like a little tower on top of a building. Now I'm working on my barn shape. And then it was like, well, I used arches over here. I'll just use arches on this too. And so I'm practicing drawing these arches in perspective. And you can see that I'm trying to get clean lines and it doesn't always happen the first time. So I undo and I try again. If you're working traditionally, obviously you can't undo, but you can draw lightly and build up or use your eraser if you want to. I do I do my tutorials digitally because it's so much easier for me just to record the screen than set up a camera and try to get the perfect lighting so you can see. And it's just sometimes the camera or like my head will be locking the camera. It's just so much easier. But don't feel like you have to draw digitally. You can completely draw, especially this tutorial. You can do it in a sketchbook or on some recycled paper if you want to. And so I'm cut into that shape and I make this. It's basically I just take a cylinder or a sphere and I use that shape to cut into that building. And then I just kind of start adding these details to it and it looks kind of like a birthday cake. But I don't know. Maybe some people like to design their buildings like birthday cakes. I don't know. And don't even ask me what that A thing is because I don't know. Like, I'm just drawing shapes and I'm trying to put them in my scene. I'm not focused on would a human actually build this. But even with like my building blocks here, and some of the things don't actually make sense, it's still just looking at it from a general view. It's like, oh, this looks like a scene. Oh, this is like a village. Or maybe, there's that rocket thing in the middle. Maybe it's like some science facility or military facility. And you don't have to do this part, but now I'm start shading. I'm going to do another video on exactly how to shade. But basically what you want to do is you want to draw lines at different tones. And for this, I just keep it simple. So I have a black, darkish tone. And this is actually what I recommend you do as a beginner is you keep the amount of shades. Like you don't want 50 shades of gray, okay? You want like 3 or 4. And so I use for like the cast shadows, the part that's facing away from the light, I'm using lines and I just keep drawing that line at a specific value. I just make that dark. And then the lines that are the parts of the shapes that are maybe turning away from the light. Like they're not directly facing the light as much, but they're not on the opposite side of the light, like the back side. So I would draw those more gray. And then the light side, I'm not even going to do any drawing at all. I'm just going to leave it blank. And that's really simple and easy to do, especially for a beginner. What I really like to do especially like this is simple. But when you get into complex drawings, it can be really easy to get lost or confused on what step you're on. So, what I recommend doing and what I personally use a lot is I will draw the darkest shadows first. Or, I'm sorry, let me back up. I would separate light and dark. So, I didn't really do that here. I just kind of went straight for drawing the dark side. But I would separate all the shadows out with light tone, like just kind of light lines that I can easily erase. And that way you can kind of see it's like, okay, this side is lit, this side is not. And then I would do all my darkest darks. So like cast shadows, light facing away, whatever is like supposed to be the hardest shadow, the darkest shadow. I do that first. And that's the part I was doing here. You saw me start with the cast shadows. Cast shadows are really good to start with because it starts adding a sense of realism real quickly. And don't overthink it. Just do the parts that you know for sure. And it's like the backside of these buildings, it's like I know are going to have the least amount of light or no light. I have my light source in the kind of like in the top left side of the page. So all the shapes facing the right side are going to be black. And so I just go through and I mark everything that I know for certain is going to be black. If I'm not sure, I might just leave it blank and come back to it. But once I've marked everything that is absolutely going to be dark, then I move on to the side that's not on the back, but on, the side plane basically. And then I start doing my midtones or my gray planes, my gray tone. But right now I'm still working on my darks. Shading this way takes a lot of time because I'm each stroke, and I'm doing this very quickly and crudely, so you can tell that there's not an even tone here. If I was doing an actual piece for like a commission for somebody, I would take more time on making sure that the tones are more even. But it does take a lot of time. But my personal opinion is it looks better just to do these hatching lines all next to each other than as opposed to taking the side of your pencil and then just doing one smooth tone or taking like a digital brush and painting the whole thing one color. It's definitely a lot quicker to use the side of your pencil, and I'm not saying you can't do it. I have done it in the past. I just like this style, this look and feel of seeing all the like pencil marks. It feels a little more traditional to me, I guess. So I like to shade in this style. I've kind of found things that make things easier aren't always like the best quality wise. And this video is not exactly in real time. I recorded this beforehand and then I'm talking over it. I'm doing a voiceover right now. Um, the line, so you see like suddenly a patch appears. It was really hard to get the video editor to slow down to the point where you could see me draw every single line. Um, I might do some real time stuff in the future, but drawing, line by line, that does take a lot of time. And I think just the shading part probably took me an hour to do. One thing I do want to mention that may not be completely obvious is like, well, what direction should I draw the lines in? And some of it's personal preference, but the main role I would say is that's going to help your composition and make your piece look better is draw lines that follow the contour surface of your drawing, of your shape. So if you have a sphere, you don't want to draw straight lines on your sphere. You want to draw curved lines. Like for the shadow part, you want to draw curved lines. And like I said, I'll do a shading tutorial that goes more in depth on this. But just think about draw your contour lines on the shape if you need to, like basically a grid, like your wireframe grid that you've probably seen for video games. And then use that as a guideline on where to draw your lines. The other thing I like to do when I'm drawing my lines for shading is I like to point, kind of like make my lines either point towards the light or maybe generate movement, which is kind of hard to explain and do. But if I have the light on the left side and I have a cast shadow on the right side, instead of drawing the shadow across, I can draw like drawing it wide. I can draw my lines parallel with like the light source. I don't know if that completely makes sense, but basically if you attach like a little triangle to them, like they're an arrow, you want to make the arrow point towards the light source. So you either want to do that or you want to make the lines follow the curve of the surface of whatever you're lighting, kind of like I'm doing here with the A shape. I'm drawing these lines. And the third thing you can do is you'll notice like on the A, I'm using horizontal lines, but on the building right next to it, I use vertical lines, like the two buildings right next to it. Some of that is personal preference, but one thing reason I used horizontal lines here is because I have this long shape on the ground, so I kind of like stick with the long part. But I'm also alternating, so I have a horizontal line next to a bunch of vertical lines that creates contrast, which also generates more interest. It makes it look more appealing to whoever is viewing the drawing. If I drew every single shadow line in the same direction, it would be kind of boring. So sometimes you have to break the rules just to make something look more interesting so people will actually want to look at it. And I think I fixed this later. I hope I do. But if you look at the wall and the kind of like at the bottom, I have this cylinder cone shape behind it. And I marked I did the cast shadow for the cone shape. But if you look at the way my drawing's set up, the cone shape's actually behind the wall. And so I drew the cast shadow, but the cast shadow actually wouldn't be seen because the wall is blocking it, and it looks like the cast shadow is on top of the wall, and it looks really awkward. So hopefully I fix this later. I think I do. Um, the half-cylinder looking rock thing by the stadium on the left is a pretty good example of what I'm talking about with shading, where I do a dark side and then it slightly turns. So now I'm doing a gray area and then it slightly turns again and then I have a white area. So I really only have 3 tones. I have white, gray, and black. But just using those 3 tones makes it feel realistic in 3D. Now this isn't like any like hyper realistic thing by any stretch in the mean. By any means, it's not going to win any awards, but just as a beginner, if you just want to use 3 tones, it will definitely help bring your drawing out and make it look 3D. I think it will help you build confidence as well, because shading is intimidating. And if you noticed, I spent like, what, 10, 15 minutes drawing my shapes. And 20 minutes later, I'm still doing the shading. Like the shading, the rendering is what takes a lot of time. Especially if you want to get it right. And once everything kind of like looks believable like you want it, now you go back through and you clean it up. You make it look a little like you can smooth out your lines. You know, maybe some of the dark areas shouldn't have as much white space. Add shadows to places that you missed. Like there's still some like cast shadows I haven't drawn. There's parts that I've missed, and you want to analyze your drawing or leave. If you leave and you come back like 15 minutes later or 30 minutes later, then like all your little mistakes will pop out a lot better and you can fix them. So I actually struggled with that hole at the bottom because I wanted it to look like a hole, but it mostly just looked like a cast shadow. And I was like, no, this is supposed to be a hole. And so the way I actually end up fixing that is I'm drawing lines down that help visually show that it's going down. So on the side of the wall, drawing vertical lines helps show that, hey, this is actually descending. And then to help sell that, I put a darker area just below it. And so now it actually feels like this part is lower than the rest of the terrain. And it's little tricks like that this exercise is going to teach you, because you run into problems. It's like, well, how do I make this look like a hole? Or how do I make this shape feel like it's in front of the other shape? Or it's basically you're doing a real drawing, but the shapes are so simple that you can actually like process it in your mind, and it's a whole lot less stressful than, okay, I'm going to draw this character or I'm going to make up this entire scene. It's like, no, keep it simple. If your goal is like me and you want to draw from your imagination, simplify it as much as possible. Do exercises that are hyper focused on keeping it simple and focus on what you want to learn. So this exercise, it helps you learn how to draw shapes in space, and you can take it further and it helps you render shapes in space in a very simple way. I'm only using 3 tones. Now, a lot of artists from a drawing perspective will use 8 if they want it to be like hyper realistic. And you can keep adding more and more gray you want to make it as more and more realistic. But my honest opinion is once you only need 4 to make something look believable, 3 or 4. 4 would make it a little bit more realistic, like if you want to do like reflective light or something. But you only need 4 different tones to make something look believable and good. You don't need 8 or 20. So I'm pretty much finished with this piece. I'm still going through adding some minor details. I add a hole back in the back. Just whatever you feel like doing. Keep it interesting. And certainly if you don't like the way something looks, change it. But I hope you found this tutorial useful. Definitely click on the video in the middle of the screen. This is going to help level up your game even more. I'll see you in the next one.